measuring peace is a great would be a great contribution to our students. Normally, what they do is assessing specific situations of Security Council sanctions or peacekeeping or any other engagement. But we haven't done much on kind of exit strategies, on post-conflict reconstruction. So far, the course was, well, we only started like 5 weeks ago with the more Chapter 7 actions, such as Iraq, 1990, 1991, the sanctions, the Yugoslavian conflict. And it comes very nicely because apart from initial engagement of the United Nations, we need also to think about what happened after. And here comes your book. How do we know when peace is stable or sustainable? What does it mean to exit, at what point, and what to do, what to measure as to exit, so to speak.
Yeah. Tell me, can you hear me well enough?
Very well. I'm hearing
okay.
very well. I hope everybody does.
Also, Ankit, is that true with you?
Yes, I can hear you, Professor. Good afternoon. And again, I can only repeat what Professor Popovski said. Very nice to reconnect after we met in 2019 last.
That's right. Because of COVID,
yes.
We haven't met since.
I could enter the UK. So
yes.
thank you for agreeing to do this virtually.
No, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much, sir.
But I just wanted to be sure that we had a good connection. I think that the headset helps to minimize extraneous noises.
Yes.
So this is a class. Is that what you're saying, Vesnan?
Yes. Well, yes, it is a course where we meet twice a week. Okay. And we also invited many other faculty, including, well, younger faculty and researchers and master students. So it's not only the class, but also some faculty members, Akriti, Aparna, Abhinav. I see several of them already.
Very good, very good. And I will have a PowerPoint presentation, which I can share with you.
Oh, definitely, please. How long do you want to initially talk about? What time do you?
I don't know, maybe 40, 45 minutes.
Yep. That's excellent. Absolutely. Yeah. And then we go for questions. I will moderate the questions.
Okay. Let me see if I can find the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, that should be visible to you. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, Professor.
Excellent. Okay. So I suppose you're waiting for more people to join.
Let's see.
I'm happy to wait.
It's already time. The class is there. Let me. Okay. Until everybody join, let me introduce Professor Caplan to the students and all the faculty. Well, probably some of us already know you. You are already connected to Jindal Global University for some time, and thank you also for supporting the summer school, which runs very successfully over many years. That's actually an invitation for students also to consider joining the next one.
They should very much. Yes, it's an excellent experience.
Absolutely. I know several students who were there, and they're extremely happy. Well, in terms of introduction, Richard is a professor in international relations in Oxford University, and his research areas are specifically post-conflict reconstruction, measuring peace, how to assess the United Nations and other international engagement in war-torn territories. By the way, Richard, I remember quoting you in one of my early when I did my PhDs, and my dissertation actually was covering former Yugoslavia back in the 1990s. Your book on Europe's new nationalism, state minorities and conflict in 1996 was one of my kind of windows to open my eyes. I was with King's College London at the time with Professor James Gow and others.
Excellent people there.
Yeah, Christopher Dundecker, Lawrence Friedman, and so on. That was probably, we probably met at IISS at some point.
I would have thought so, yes.
In the 1990s. But then Professor Caplan also is visiting, professor in several universities, such as European University Institute in Italy, University of Constance, Princeton, Science Po, and probably next could be Jindal Global University.
I would welcome that.
We would be happy to employ you in a visiting capacity one day. So let's move on. And I remember also some correspondence with you, Richard, back when I was in Tokyo. I worked for the United Nations University between 2004 and 2014 for 10 years. And we may have discussed a few projects at the time. I remember these were the times when the Peacebuilding Commission was created in 2005.
That's right.
And a lot of academics were asked to help the Commission and the support office with some ideas. I remember also attending the meeting with the University of Ottawa with Professor Paris.
That's right.
Assembled how to help the Commission in terms of how to measure what is sustainable. How do we know when peace is stable or sustainable? How to assess progress? Is it a process or is it kind of one change, kind of transition to how to assess transition for peace? Why 5 years and not less or longer and so on? So definitely, I haven't seen, I have known about this book, but I haven't read it yet. So I'm very curious myself, as all our students today, if you can tell us in the next 40 minutes, what is the status of how do we assess peace? How do we know when peace is stable and so on? Please go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. Thank you also to Ankit Malhotra, who first extended the invitation to me. I'm delighted to be with you today, and I very much look forward to the opportunity to be with you physically one day, to visit Jindal, with which, as Veselin has been just saying, I've had involvement with now for almost 10 years in view of the work I've been doing to support the summer school at Oxford, the two summer schools, because the first was in law, and then more recently we established one in international relations. So what I'm going to be talking about today are some ideas that I discuss in my book, and the book and the talk today relate to the work of the United Nations, not exclusively, and what I have to say is relevant to other organizations. As I'm sure you are aware, there are many organizations that are engaged in peace building, in post-conflict recovery, and they have common challenges. So the issues that I'm going to be discussing today are not unique to the United Nations, but they're certainly relevant to the United Nations and to other organizations. And the question which Veselin has just alluded to, that is at the heart of the book and my presentation today, is the following question. So how do we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? And by stable, I mean not prone to relapse. Now, peace stability is one dimension of quality peace. It's not the only dimension, and I'll come back to that point a little bit later, but it is a very important dimension. Now, why is peace stability important? it's pretty self-evident, but I'll mention a number of different reasons. The first is the vulnerability of conflict-affected countries to conflict relapse. Now, with my colleague Anka Heffler, we looked at all internal conflicts, that is, all civil wars that ended in or after 1990 until 2013. And we looked at how long the peace endured in each of those cases. Now, for the purposes of this analysis, we look at what we call peace spells, and a peace spell is marked by the end of an armed conflict, whether that peace is established as a result of a military victory, a ceasefire, or peace agreement, or even simply just fizzling out. Sometimes conflicts just fizzle out. As long as that peace spell lasts for a year, it constitutes, for our purposes of analysis, a peace spell. And we observed that in this period from 1990 to 2013, there were 210 peace spells. That is 210 conflict episodes ended in peace that lasted for at least a year. Now, just to be clear, those are not 210 separate conflicts, because a single conflict can have multiple conflict episodes and multiple peace spells. It can stop and start over the course of its history. So what you're looking at now, this chart depicts how many peace spells break down and when this happens. In other words, it shows how long peace survives, and it's measured in days. So in the beginning, all of our observations are at peace, so which is what you would expect. After 2 years even, 99% of all peace spells survive. That is, only 1% of all peace spells have failed and armed conflict has recurred. After 3 years, 83% of the peace spells have survived. But after 12 years, only about half of the peace spells have survived. Now, that's a very high rate of peace failure. Indeed, if you were to extend the timeline, if you were to look at the period between 1946 and 2013 and focus on conflict-affected countries, 105 countries suffered civil wars in that period. And of these countries, of these 105 countries, more than half of them, 59 countries, experienced a relapse into violent conflict, in some cases more than once, after peace had been established. All right, so that's one reason why peace stability matters, and that is the high rate of conflict relapse or conflict recidivism. Another reason why peace stability matters is because of the cost of peacekeeping and peace building. And here you can see the cost of UN peacekeeping expenditure from 1950 to 2013. Now, the approved budget for UN peacekeeping operations for the fiscal year that just ended, 30 June 2020, is just a little bit lower than what you see here. It's about 6.5 billion, but still quite significant. Now, bear in mind that this is for UN peacekeeping only. It doesn't include other UN peace consolidation efforts, nor the costs of the efforts of other organizations. Indeed, if you look at this chart, you'll see additionally that there are a number of regional peace organizations, that is non-UN organizations, and they have also had peace operations in the period under review from 1946 to 2013. Regional organizations, especially in Africa and Europe, have been taking on more and more responsibility for peacekeeping and peace consolidation. And these are also costly operations. So peace operation expenditure is another reason why peace stability matters. Vezem was just referring earlier to the UN Peacebuilding Commission established in 2015. Conflict relapse or conflict recidivism is the main reason why the UN Peacebuilding Commission was established at the World Summit in 2015. I'm sorry, in 2005. And the thinking was that countries that are emerging from violent conflict are very fragile countries. As we just saw, they are prone to conflict relapse. And the difficulty is that these countries often fall off the agenda, fall off the radar of the international community once the fighting ends. And yet they remain very, very fragile. So the thinking behind the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission was to help to ensure that these fragile post-conflict countries would remain on the agenda of the international community. But the challenge that the Peacebuilding Commission faces is the following. When should a PBC country graduate? And here you have the 6 countries that are currently on the agenda. No one PBC country has yet graduated. No one PBC country has yet come off the agenda of the Commission or the Security Council. So how do they graduate? And it's not an academic question. It's a very genuine question for the PBC. Now, the enabling resolution that established the PBC does have the answer to that question, and it's the following. The Commission shall terminate its consideration of a country-specific situation when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established or upon the request of national authorities of the country under consideration. So either when the country in question says we no longer wish to be on the agenda of the PBC, or the resolution tells us when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established. But this only begs the question, really, because when are the foundations for sustainable peace and development established? This is the key question. And the problem is that there are no hard measures or indicators of a consolidated peace, in contrast to, if you think about it, the indicators of a prosperous economy, notably certain macroeconomic fundamentals, or a healthy population, immunization rates, or literacy rates. Now, some of those can be contentious. You may know that there's a lot of debate over the use of GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure, for instance, of economic prosperity, but they do give us a fairly reliable indication of the health of an economy or the physical health of a population. But we don't have anything comparable in the way of a measure for peace. Now, the absence of armed conflict, you could say, is a measure of peace, but it's actually really just symptomatic of a stable peace. It's not itself an indicator of a stable peace. Okay, so what kinds of ways can we think of to measure peace? There are various ways to approach this question, and one is to determine whether the factors that are known by scholars to be responsible for the onset, for the cause of civil war, are present in a particular case. And if they are present, then we can perhaps assume that the peace is not a stable peace. And scholars have identified 3 broad classes of causes. The first is motivation. Motivation encompasses a wide range of often grievance-based subfactors, and you may recognize some of the terms that are associated with motivation: relative deprivation, horizontal inequalities, ethnic insecurity. Okay, so motivation is one factor known to be responsible for the onset of civil war. The second is feasibility, which stresses more the importance of opportunity over motivation, suggesting, for instance, that rebellion is more likely to occur when material conditions favor it, when there's mountainous terrain, when there are natural resources that, for instance, rebels can exploit to help support their effort. And then the third factor is resilience. And this emphasizes the vulnerability of the state to various internal and external pressures. So, for instance, rising food prices, migration, climate change, and the capacity of states and their institutions to cope effectively with these pressures. If there is a lack of resilience, then these countries are going to be more vulnerable to conflict and to conflict relapse. Now, all this is fine, but there are two problems with this approach. First, there is no consensus among scholars as to which causal factors matter or matter most. Indeed, as one scholar, Charles Call, has observed in his book, Why Peace Fails, he writes, and now I'm quoting, there is tremendous disparity among scholars about whether certain factors are important or not, and about the degree to which they are important. So a lack of consensus is a problem. But secondly, this approach assumes that the causes of conflict onset are the same as the causes of conflict recurrence. Now, there is some overlap. Again, Chuck Call in his book has shown that there are some shared risk factors, including political instability, population size, reliance on natural resources. These are often associated with both conflict onset and recurrence, but there are also significant differences. And for one thing, wars are transformative. So the root causes of a conflict may no longer pertain as a consequence of changes that the conflict may have generated. There might be, for instance, population displacements or the rise of new political elites. I mean, think about the civil war in Afghanistan from 1989 to 1992, which facilitated the rise of fundamentalist Muslim forces, including the Taliban, that in turn provoked a new civil war from 1992. But those forces were not present, or were not present to the same degree in the first civil war. So they were a new factor. Okay, so that's one approach that one can take, as I said, to assessing whether the peace is stable, and that's to think about the causes of conflict and whether they pertain in a country at peace in question. Another approach is to focus not on the causes of war, but if you will, on the causes of peace in the aftermath of civil war. So think what measures have been most successful in maintaining the peace after violent conflict, and have they been applied to the cases in question? And again, the range of possibilities and the differences among scholars is quite considerable. Scholars have stressed the importance of the nature of the Civil War termination, whether it's a military victory or negotiated settlement. Military victories are thought to be more stable because the outcome is a more conclusive one than a negotiated settlement. Another determinant of peace may be third-party security guarantees, whether there are peacekeepers, stabilization forces. These are factors that have been thought to contribute to the endurance of peace. Also, the nature of the political settlement, whether it has been inclusive or whether it has favored one party to the exclusion of other parties. But as I said, as with the previous approach, there's a lack of consensus among scholars as to the effects of these measures and which measures matter most. Okay, but having said that, there is certainly recognition of the importance of monitoring the quality of peace and the progress of peace consolidation, but there's also recognition of the difficulty, among some scholars at least, as is evident in this quotation that's on your screen now. Monitoring the progress of peace is of such obvious value in any post-conflict society that the worth of doing so is rarely, if ever, challenged. However, the means used to do so is another matter. So how do the major peace-building actors, and I'm including the UN here, how do they assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace? How do they know whether the peace that they're working to establish is a self-sustaining peace? And the fact is, they often don't know. Now, before I say anything about the practices that characterize assessment, I want to acknowledge that there are notable exceptions to what I'm going to be talking about right now. Indeed, I'm going to be talking about some of those exceptions as well in just a moment. And there is a growing awareness of the deficiencies of both past and current practice. But despite those notable exceptions and lots of finely worded documents, many of the observations I'm about to make are, in my view, valid. Now, to begin with, rarely are peace-building organizations actually tasked with assessing the robustness of the peace that they're helping to build. And this is what in the book I call strategic assessment. Very rarely are they actually asked to carry out, to conduct a strategic assessment. What instead they often do is to report on developments in the field. But that's not, reporting itself is not strategic assessment. Every head of a UN peacekeeping operation, for instance, submits formal periodic reports to the Secretary General, who in turn reports to the Security Council on the situation in the country in question, often on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis. And here you see a facsimile of one of those reports. The reports vary in their content, but they typically provide an overview of major developments since the last report, an evaluation of progress in the implementation of the mandate of the operation, and a discussion of the key challenges facing the country in the operation. Reporting has tended to be ad hoc and rather impressionistic. The UN Secretariat lacks a uniform understanding of the purpose of a field report and a Security Council briefing, and little guidance is provided in preparing them. Now, how do I know this? Because I've spoken with many former heads of operations, and this is what they've told me, that they are given very little guidance about how to prepare these reports. There's also a tendency to measure what can be measured easily. So, for instance, measuring the number of training sessions on human rights that might be organized for police officers or for judges, rather than evaluating their qualitative effect. In other words, how respectful are the police of human rights? How respectful of human rights are court trials? In other words, they look at outputs typically rather than outcomes. And also the focus tends to be, as I said, not on strategic assessment, but on mandate implementation. Now, this is reasonable because these operations are tasked with certain responsibilities, certain mandates. It's only reasonable to try to ascertain whether they are implementing their mandates, but these mandates do not always reflect the requirements for achieving a stable peace. Mandates are often the fruits of political compromise. They're not derived from a very careful assessment of the requirements for peace. And finally, operations are often partial, and assessment is often partial, not holistic. And that's because it's sort of the bad consequence of a good thing. The good thing is that more and more organizations are engaged in peace building. It is not the responsibility of just one country, one organization. It reflects engagement by many different donor countries, multilateral organizations, non-governmental organizations. But the problem as a consequence of all this involvement is that everybody has a kind of small piece of the pie. And so their view and preoccupation is a partial one, not a holistic one about the peace overall. So broadly speaking, the concern is fundamentally about evaluating the performance of peace operations, not with evaluating the quality of the peace that these operations are helping to produce. Now, I mentioned that there are notable exceptions, and in the book I talk about a number of them. I'm just going to discuss two of them briefly with you now. The first is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Now, you may remember back in 2008, there was an outbreak of fighting in Georgia when the Georgian government tried to, if you will, regain control over breakaway territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And that effort provoked a conflict with Russia. And this caught the OSCE by surprise. They were not anticipating a renewed outbreak of violence. And so as a consequence, they decided we were ill-prepared. We need to develop internal guidelines for early warning that will allow us to undertake a more systematic and structured approach to the identification of potential conflicts and crisis situations. So what they did was they created a conflict analysis toolkit and a set of early warning indicators for use in the organization's field operations. And together, the toolkit and indicators provide a framework for the systematic analysis of conflict settings at the local, regional, national, and international levels, including but not limited to assessments about the robustness or fragility of the peace that's been established. Now, the framework stresses the importance of appreciating the relevant contextual issues, and this is really important, a point I'll come back to a little bit later. And by this, they meant socioeconomic, political conditions, in order to comprehend the specificities of a conflict, as well as the influence that the broader context can exert on conflict dynamics, the regional and international environment. Now, by the OSCE's own reckoning, in the first year since the introduction of the framework, so that's to July 2013, the OSCE Secretary General raised concerns about what he called worrying developments that threatened the peace on 11 occasions with respect to the OSCE region. Now, incredibly, just by contrast, East Timor, which also experienced an outbreak of violence in 2006, a country where the UN had been engaged since 1999 and very heavily establishing a transitional administration there from 2000. The violence of 2006, the renewal of outbreak of violence there, also caught the UN off guard. And incredibly, there had been no conflict analysis, no significant conflict analysis of the country's situation in the period leading up to 2006. Okay, so early warning, OSCE style, is one very positive, notable exception. Another, and the only other one I'll mention for the purposes of this lecture, is benchmarking, which is within the context of UN peacekeeping. Now, benchmarking is a form of evaluation that uses specified indicators, a value, a process, a state of affairs, the attainment of which it's thought contributes to the realization of the operation's broad objectives. So just to give you an example, the reduction and elimination of militia threats may be a benchmark for the establishment of a secure environment. Now, if done properly, benchmarking can introduce greater rigor and precision into assessments and allow for monitoring progress towards achieving a stable peace. So, for instance, the UN mission in Sierra Leone, UNAMSIL, established in October 1999, was actually the first UN peacekeeping operation to employ benchmarking. This mission was established after an 8-year civil war. And when the Security Council was considering when it might be appropriate to draw down and withdraw, they instructed the Secretary General to establish benchmarks that would guide the UN mission in its decisions about drawdown. And here you can see what those benchmarks were. There were basically 5 of them, and these were established in 2002. And the underlying premise was that the government should be capable of maintaining external and internal security without international assistance. That was the standard that these benchmarks were meant to measure. And as I said, they included building up the capacity of the Sierra Leone police, reintegrating former combatants, consolidating state authority throughout the country, restoring effective government control over diamond mining. Again, remember what I said about the extent way in which natural resources can fuel conflict in a country, and achieve significant progress towards the resolution of conflict in neighboring Liberia, because conflicts are often not isolated events. They often take place and are very much influenced by regional developments. But going back to the first one, building up the capacity of the Sierra Leone police and army, the UN meticulously went from region to region to assess the effectiveness of the police and the army, to assess whether they were fit to be able to maintain security, to maintain peace in the regions under their control. So it was a very, very thorough analysis that led ultimately the UN to conclude that it was possible to withdraw the UN peacekeeping force, and indeed, Sierra Leone has remained peaceful since that time. So I wanted just to give you a concrete example. By the way, just going back to what I was saying about benchmarking, by 2014, 7 out of 17 UN peacekeeping operations and 2 out of 13 special political missions had introduced benchmarking, often at the request of the Security Council, and again, largely to track and measure progress. Okay, so what I want to do is then just conclude by saying a few words about principles of good practice. I don't, for the purposes of this book, actually come up, if you will, with a way of measuring peace, because I maintain that the approach has to be sensitive to the conditions, to the requirements of the conflict situation in question. But what I do is to identify principles of good practice that, in my view, should inform any approach that might be undertaken. And the first principle that I discuss is what I call an adoption of an ethnographic approach. Now, some of you may be familiar with the work of Séverine Althusser from Columbia University. In her book, Peaceland, she talks about an ethnographic approach, but she uses this to describe her method, her method of conducting research, which was to embed herself in peace-building organizations in order to be able to better observe them. What I refer to as an ethnographic approach is reliance on knowledge of local culture, local history, and especially the particular conflict dynamics at work in a given conflict, including at the micro level, because conflict dynamics vary across a country. Take a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the size of Western Europe. What's happening in Eastern Congo is very different to what's happening, for instance, in the West or in the North. And so you cannot treat the country as a single undifferentiated whole. What Althusser says in her book is that familiarity with local context is crucial. In-depth knowledge of local histories, cultures, traditions, attitudes, and worldviews remain critical throughout the project implementation. And just to give you an example of that, Rory Stewart, some of you may know, who served in the reconstruction of Iraq following the US-led invasion in 2003, as well as in Afghanistan. He co-wrote a book called Can Intervention Work?, which I recommend to you as a very worthwhile read. But in that, based on his experiences, especially serving in Afghanistan, he bemoaned the lack of local knowledge on the part of international personnel, which he called, and I'm quoting, "a central cause of the humiliating mess in Afghanistan." Indeed, I think that there were very few, for instance, among the international personnel, very few speakers of local languages. And so there was already a gulf between international personnel who were deployed to the country and the population itself. Similarly, but going back quite a long time, Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense in the United States in the Johnson administration and the chief architect of the Vietnam War, in his memoirs, he came to recognize belatedly that the war that he was the chief architect for was a failed initiative. And in his memoirs, he acknowledged what he called our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics of the people on the area. For a very long time, the United States thought that the war that was fighting in Vietnam was a war of conquest by communist countries, the Soviet Union and China, to conquer this region of Asia, and failing to appreciate that this was first and foremost a war of self-determination, of national liberation against colonial rule, first French and now really American-backed powers. And all this was not apparent because, as McNamara pointed out, our profound ignorance. So ethnographic approach, a very strong grasp, as I said, of local histories, cultures, traditions, attitudes, and worldviews, absolutely critical to assessing the stability of peace in a country. Another important principle is what I call continual strategic reassessment. And by that I mean that peace builders have to ask themselves repeatedly, do the original objectives still support the broad strategic goals of the peacekeeping operation? Have new or unanticipated threats or impediments to a stable peace emerge? For instance, are there new external security challenges or inauspicious political shifts that might require the articulation of new or altered objectives? Has available implementing capacity, both internationally and nationally, changed? And what implications does this have for meeting the operations objectives and for achieving a sustainable exit? So there has to be a continual reassessment of the challenges and whether the approach and the resources available to implement that approach are appropriate. And the third principle that I'll mention, there are others that I discuss in the book, are the incorporation of local perspectives. It's absolutely critical, going back to what I said about an ethnographic approach, not only to understand, but to draw on, to the extent possible, the perspectives of the conflict-affected communities. I mean, after all, it is their peace. It is not an international peace, and indeed the risk is often that what is being introduced or what is even being imposed are norms, values, practices that may be alien to the thinking, to the wishes of the local population. So just a couple of concluding observations. I've been talking about strategic assessment. I just want to stress that it's not merely a technical exercise. It's that partly. In other words, we can talk about the so-called technical requirements for sustaining peace. And we do know, for instance, the technical requirements for carrying out free and fair elections. So to that extent, yes, it is a technical exercise. But peace is also about normative choices. Is it better to forgive, to forget, or to punish? These are partly normative choices. There's empirical evidence that would support one choice over another, but at the end of the day, it is, again, the affected community that's going to decide what kind of peace do we want to build? What kind of future do we want for ourselves? Again, those are not strictly technical questions. Another thing that we need to remember is that strategic assessment, although it is extremely important, it is not a panacea. It is not a silver bullet. We are always going to be limited in our understanding of the conflict dynamics in question, what social scientists refer to sometimes as bounded rationality. Conflicts are highly complex. They're not linear events, and it's very, very difficult to be able to anticipate how a conflict, including in the peace building phase, is going to unfold. And that's, again, going back to what I was saying before about continual reassessment. That's one reason why it is important to be able to assess, reassess continually, because we're continually learning more about the conflict situation, assuming that we're learning anything at all. And the other thing I'll mention is that we're talking as if we're operating in a rational universe, and we often are with regard to these matters. But at the end of the day, politics is often what governs decisions about whether, for instance, to draw down or withdraw. In an ideal world, these decisions would be taken with respect to the capacity of a conflict-affected state to withstand independence, in other words, to be able to function without the scaffolding of peace operations. But while that is certainly given consideration, it isn't always the case. Very often, political decisions drive the decision by the Security Council whether to withdraw from an operation or not. So that is, as I said, an overview. I hope that you found it interesting.
Thank you, Richard. It was an amazing, comprehensive expose of the book, and also of raising all these, I will say, uneasy questions. I already typed down 2 comments and 2 questions, so let me start myself before students get prepared for their question.
Am I visible, by the way, just to make sure? Yes, because I've come off my PowerPoint.
Absolutely. My first comment goes back to what you describe as approach to measuring peace. As you mentioned, there are 2 ways. One is to focus on the cause of conflict-based assessment, and the second is on peace determinants. Quite curiously, by the way, if we look at the criminal law, and here our students will probably be very happy to see that comparison, when a detective need to identify the perpetrator of a crime, they will look exactly in terms of first motivation, second opportunity, and the third one will be the weapon. And as you mentioned, Richard, the focus on cause of conflict-based assessment would be questioned by some academics, because what does prevail? Is the motivation or is the opportunity prevail? Here, I would add also a third difficulty, which is that conflicts may mutate. They can start with certain motivation, but over time they may. It's not only the reoccurrence of a conflict, but even the same conflict. Let's take Syria. Syria started with grievance, and a few years later, some Islamic radical groups emerged, and foreign actors also infected seriously the Syrian. So what started exactly 10 years ago in 2011, in terms of motivation, in terms of opportunity, and in terms of weapon, all 3 factors in the causes of conflict might mutate over time. So assessment on the beginning might not be the same as assessment afterwards. And obviously, the peace determinants that you mentioned, the nature of ceasefire, the third-party guarantee, the nature of political settlement, those look much more solid. If in the conflict causes we are very ambiguous and those mutate, in the peace determinants, we know very well how the ceasefire was achieved. We know very well who are the third party here. Here we are much more on a solid ground to assess. And here comes my second kind of comment is when you said the Peacebuilding Commission had this tried to define, although they couldn't, the foundation for sustainable peace. Similarly, we are between the ambiguity of a text, what are the foundations, and I would even ask, is it good to have some ambiguous text in the UN document where we can remain flexible to interpret? And who needs ambiguity and who needs specificity is also a good question. For academics, probably specificity will be better. For practitioners on the ground, probably ambiguity. But again, depends. Some practitioners also prefer to be very specific rather than to have the freedom of interpretation of mandate. By the way, in a book I published in 2012 called After Oppression, we look at the question, how do we measure success in transitional justice in this circumstance? And what we identify as possibility to measure success in transitional justice were, in fact, three approaches. One was to compare to an ideal, somehow to imagine what would be an ideal justice and whether the particular situation, we look at Latin American and Eastern European comparisons, whether which situation in Peru or Chile or Argentina or Romania or Poland can be matching that ideal we have in our mind as idealists. The second is more the comparing to other situations, and again, try to measure success. For example, did Poland do better than East Germany and so on? And the third was success for whom? And this is interesting, success for whom? And it kind of very much refers to your critique of the United Nations way of reporting, because usually the United Nations try to report the success of the mandate, the success of the peacekeeping force, the success of the person on the ground. But that success means the same for New York, people in New York, and the same for people, for the local actors. It's really obviously not the same. And for that matter, when we usually measure, we measure based on our rational-minded, liberal democracy-guided values. So for us as Indians who live in the biggest democracy in the world, with strong rule of law, with judges who are independent, the values are very well established, and it's the same in Britain. Britain and India will be very much thinking of, for example, elections as representing people proportionately in power. We will think about the market economy as leading to individual entrepreneurship and prosperity. But in fragile post-conflict situations, the same values might need time to mature. So elections may divide. Market economy may make somebody rich, another person poor. So the same value that we create in our liberal-minded rationality might not be the same as fragile. That is somehow to add another difficulty in the assessing what peace does mean in one situation and another. And my kind of first question to you is, how do you see the continuous commitment in a situation where nobody talks about that country anymore? So somehow, how to persuade the public opinion or the parliaments to continue an engagement in a situation which de-escalated in terms of violence. It's no longer in the news, but it needs continuous. Exactly, the Peacebuilding Commission was trying to channel, to galvanize support for operations in situations, but they are no longer covered by the media. So we have a kind of a lack of support here. And connected to that, how to engage in protracted conflicts, where we might have the opposite. We might have a fatigue, tiredness from long engagement. So on one hand, we have Kashmir situation. Interesting probably to know your opinion on Kashmir, on Palestine and Gaza. Protracted long conflict with a lot of efforts, but not much success, and some sort of fatigue to engage from situations which, on the opposite, de-escalated, but then they are no longer in the minds of politicians and parliamentarians. And my second question will be this issue of quantity versus quality. How can we quantify peace? It's easy to quantify economic GDP data or health, how many people die from coronavirus, how many cases are there, how many are vaccinated. So when it is easily quantifiable, measurables, then one thing. But we often talk about quality of peace. How can we quantify peace so that we can be in a bit of a more solid ground here? And what do you think, for example, for the Global Peace Index? Do they do a good work measuring the peacefulness of countries? And how do you assess their methodology? Let's start with those, and then we will open for more after.
Okay. Well, there's a lot food for thought, Vestlin, in what you've just said. So, with regard to your questions, the challenge of maintaining interest in focus on conflict-affected countries after they have ceased to be headline news is, as I said, one of the reasons why the Peacebuilding Commission was established. And it has had some success for at least those 6 countries on the Commission's agenda. It is a challenge. It is one reason why sometimes multilateral organizations can be more successful. I'll give you an example. Kosovo is very much, for the most part, out of the news, but it remains a concern of the European Union precisely because it is a territory within the space of the EU, surrounded by EU countries, and it's very difficult for the EU to ignore the country. In some ways, it's helped by the fact that it is not the responsibility primarily of single member states within the EU, but of the Commission and various other organs of the EU, which help, I think, to maintain the focus. It is part of a process, you could say, of accession, even though accession is a long way in the future. But there is a process underway, and the fact that it's embedded in that process helps to maintain a focus on a country that otherwise might not receive the kind of attention that it receives. But I think it's important also to draw in lead states. This actually does happen within the United Nations, where member states take often responsibility, have special, sometimes interest because of former historical relations with these countries, for good and for bad. I'm thinking about colonial relations that they may have, but sometimes also they adopt a country. Think about Norway and Sri Lanka. where Norway for a very long time took a strong interest in the conflict in Sri Lanka. So to the extent that countries can be prevailed upon, sometimes this can be done around initiatives of friends of the Secretary General.
Or Australia and Timor-Leste would be another example.
Timor-Leste, yeah.
Australia, again, leading the effort there.
And there's also been efforts by conflict-affected countries themselves, the so-called G7 plus countries, which have come together to work with donor governments in particular to provide them with guidance as to how they should be engaging with building peace in these countries. So I do think it's true. The problem that you mentioned is a challenge, but I think that there's actually been, in some ways, very significant progress. Institutions have emerged that are helping to compensate for what in the past would have been a very significant loss of interest. Protracted conflict is a different matter, and I would suggest that there are two kinds here. There are the very old, if you will. I'm thinking about the two earliest conflicts, Middle East and the one you've just referred to, Kashmir, continue to have UN peace operations deployed there. I don't detect that there's a lot of impatience with those operations, even though, of course, everybody would hope that there could be a resolution of the conflicts that would lead to justification for the withdrawal of these operations. But I think that the conflicts, protracted conflicts that are of greater concern for member states are those that are much larger and expensive as a consequence. And I'm thinking in particular the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Afghanistan. And here we saw, especially under the Trump administration with Nikki Haley, a growing impatience with the continued engagement of the UN in some of these countries. And I have to say that it was an impatience that wasn't limited to the United States. It actually was shared by many other countries. And so I think that you're seeing more emphasis placed on identifying ways of scaling back. Lowering of ambitions is part of the process, I would say. I think that the mandates reflect lower ambitions to some extent for these operations. So I do think that there, and you saw, as I said, also a declining expenditure, not hugely, a huge decline, but I mean, we are spending less now on peace operations than we were a couple of years ago. So I think that there is a bit of a move among the member states of the UN to try to bring things to an end, scale back these operations, especially, as I said, the protracted and more costly ones. And as far as quantity and quality, there are measures for all these things. Very often, the most widely used measure quantitatively of peace is the absence of violence. And you see this in the various data sets, the correlates of war, the UCDP PRIO, UNAMSIL conflict data program data sets, which measure battlefield-related deaths. And this is a common, widely used measure of how peaceful a country is. There are critics of those measures. There will always be. There will never be unanimity with regard to how we do these things, but they have become very widely used measures of peace. Among other things, the critics say they're actually not measuring peace. They're measuring the absence of war, armed conflict, and that's not quite the same thing. And that's where you get onto the second part of that, your second question, the quality of peace. And these are not measures of quality. And here we see a proliferation of indicators. There's really quite a cottage industry now. You mentioned the global peace indicators. They're just one among numerous, at least a dozen different indicators. And depending on the indicator or index in question, I wouldn't be able to discuss all of them, but I think that what a lot of them have in common and what is a weakness of a lot of them is that what they actually are snapshots. They are snapshots of the country in question at a given time, moment in time. They do not tell us if that country is leaning towards or away from conflict, in my view, anyway. Whether there are, factors at work that would undermine the peace, or whether there are factors at work that are contributing to a consolidation of the peace. And I feel that they just don't get at the granular level of analysis that you need to be able to do that. Their chief merit, and what a lot of people look at, is ranking. Yes. Where does one country stand in relation to another country, or where does one country stand this year in relation to where it stood last year? Has it gone up the scale, gone down the scale? And they're often used for that purpose, which I think is of limited value for the sorts of things that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. It's similar to the university rankings. Students shouldn't look at just rankings. They should also go deeper than that. And when they
don't tell your vice chancellor that.
Okay, let's. By the way, I'm also curious about your new project, which is called After Exit and Assessing Consequences of Peacekeeping Withdrawal 5 years after peacekeepers left, and what that means. What are the cases there? Any early findings?
That is a new research project, and we are looking at the consequences of the withdrawal of peacekeeping operations for host states. So what are their experiences looking across a wide range of areas, economic, security, political/administrative, how do they fare in the period after peacekeepers leave? And we are actually looking at all countries that have had that have been host to major peacekeeping operations in which more than 1,000 armed police or soldiers have been deployed at one point. We're looking at all countries, but we're focusing more closely on 3, and those are Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Haiti, where we're doing much more in-depth analysis. It's kind of early to be able to report on findings, but we are seeing that there are significant but differentiated effects of withdrawal in the economic sphere. As you can imagine, where individuals in the country have, for one reason or another, been affected economically, often positively, by the deployment of peacekeepers, and the withdrawal of those peacekeepers has had an impact on their economic livelihood. So we are definitely finding that to be the case. But again, it varies because it depends on whether the individual has been affected by the peace. It's often very localized, the effects that they have had.
That's probably your next lecture for Jindal. 1 year from now, we can bring you back for that. Ankit is raising hand for a question. Please, Ankit.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I really liked the phrase when you said scaffolding of peace. I think that sort of summarizes what the peacekeeping missions are all about, and also the fact that it's more about, for the study at least, it's more about the output and not the outcome. You did briefly discuss about 2 points which I would like to use as a lens. First, the case of Kashmir, and the other one of Israel-Palestine. I'll not go into the both cases, but I'll use them to refer to the case of Cyprus and the United Nations mission there. You also see how Cyprus has, in at least relative terms, had better outcomes, but you do also see these scars which are left of the United Nations mission there. You also highlighted that you can use different fragments to analyze or to assess the development which is taking place, but you also, and this has in fact even been appreciated by the European Union in terms of the work which is done by the real estate in Cyprus. But of course, that has a very dark undertone and underbelly to it. So this is what my question is: how exactly do you assess a case like Cyprus, which has so many historical linkages of dispute, and which on prima facie seems as a case which is done relatively well in comparison to other countries, but still has a lot of ongoing issues at hand? Thank you.
So, I mean, Cyprus is a territory at peace at the moment, in the sense that there are no significant incidents of armed violence, armed conflict, but it is clearly a very fragile, vulnerable state that is prone to conflict relapse, because the peace is supported by the presence of UN peacekeepers and in the absence of a political settlement. This is what's missing from the equation. We come very close. We have come very, very close over the past decade to reaching a settlement, only to find that it has evaporated. And sometimes it's thought that we need the passing of a generation whose views are more hardened before we can see acceptance of a political settlement that would require a degree of compromise. I'm optimistic. I think that day will come, as it has almost come, as I said, in the past decade. But until that time, I think it does make sense to maintain an international presence. The cost of maintaining the presence is far less than would be the cost of a resumption of fighting. And I have to say, with the changes that have occurred in Turkey, especially over the last several years, many of which, in my view, are rather worrying, I think that it's all the more important to have an international presence to ensure that there isn't what I fear could be some, if you will, adventurism on the part of the Erdogan government that would be used for, if you will, domestic purposes. I'm speaking, am I speaking? I don't even know if I'm speaking off the record, but those are very, very candid comments about the worrying developments in Turkey. I should have asked you, Veselin, is this publicly
don't worry
available?
about that. We will be confidential. Don't worry. That's okay. Okay. Now let's move for more questions. Somehow I cannot open my screen very well. Is there somebody? Can somebody just unmute yourself and ask questions if I don't see your hands up? Who would like to follow up? Yes, go ahead.
Professor Caplan and Dr. Popovski, thank you for your inputs. I think it's been a very enlightening discussion in the light of whatever's happening around us. To draw an analogy from a paper I read recently by Professor Susan Marks of Understanding Root Causes in Human Rights. So to draw a parallel with that, I think it's very important to understand how, comprehensively reports have to be written, because this is something that even she addresses, that a lot of times conflict situations or, situations which are challenging, they do not address what are the root causes that, lead to a particular situation. So I think it'll be good to understand that when we say it's a peaceful environment, what are the root causes and what all goes inside or to create such an environment. My question after the comment is basically related to the indicators, Dr. Caplan. In terms of understanding that when we're deciding indicators, this is a question that even you raised in your presentation, that to what extent are we seeing or have you seen in in including more local perspective. This is something that you've argued for. But in terms of deciding indicators, numbers cannot really give you a very clear picture unless unless you're designing the indicator as such, or unless you're declaring the intention of the indicator as such, because I mean, for an expert such as you, as an academic, you can understand. But let's say for a layperson, or let's say somebody who's reading, so the impression and the opinion that they may understand, they may not be able to grasp the weight behind that. So in designing the indicators, especially related to peace, in designing the anthropological perspective as well as the ethnographic perspective that you were talking about, how are you seeing it being more inclusive? And how do you see the indicators, addressing in creating a clearer picture for a reader?
Well, very good question. I think that there are different aspects to the question. And in the first instance, I think that indicators need to be sensitive to local concerns, local desires, and I mean, I gave the example of justice, transitional justice. I think that it's there will be instances where communities wish to move on. They don't want a form of retributive justice, and I think that it's important in designing a transitional justice policy that we are sensitive to that. Now, we talk about local perspective as if it's a single undifferentiated perspective, and this is the real problem, because we're talking about conflict affected communities. These communities are highly polarized, so the community members may amongst themselves have very different views about what would be the basis for sustainable peace. I mean, just take the Israeli-Palestinian question. For Palestinians, a viable Palestinian state is absolutely necessary for a sustainable peace in the region. For Israelis, for different reasons, that is unacceptable. I mean, either because of expansionistic views, Zionistic views of that they may hold, or because they view an independent Palestinian state as a threat, a security threat. And so we can't speak about a single perspective that needs to be reflected. And it is a real challenge because there is, what is the compromise position in such a case? Similarly, Serbia, Kosovo, it was once thought the compromise would be a high degree of autonomy for all of Kosovo, and now, for instance, for the Serbian community within Kosovo, which does indeed enjoy a high degree of autonomy. But that falls short of satisfying really all parties in some way. So compromise is not always the answer. So I think I've answered only part of your question. The first part remind me about whether they can grasp, for instance. Yes, I mean, I do think so, and this is where I may differ with scholars, my colleagues who are proponents of, for instance, everyday peace indicators. I think was a extraordinarily a brilliant project approach, which does capture the kinds of things that we've been talking about. But I do think that scholars have certain insights which may not be available to, and practitioners for that matter, may not be available to individuals who haven't got, for instance, the comparative perspective. to give you an example, the timing or sequencing of reforms, there might, or elections, what should, how they should proceed. We know a lot about elections, why they're successful and when they're not. And I think that it's important to bring this knowledge to bear on any local arrangements, but to try to, at the same time, be sensitive to, as I said, local concerns, not just with respect to elections, but with respect to any kinds of measures that might be adopted. But it's I'm not suggesting that it's always going to be an easy fit. But I think to the extent that we can take on board local understandings, local aspirations, that's really important in constructing. Certainly now we're talking about peace building strategies, but I think that even any measure of peace needs to have those in mind.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Faraz has his hand up.
Okay. Yes, next. Who wants to ask?
Thank you, Professor. This has been very insightful. I was looking at the factors that you mentioned, which is motivation, feasibility, and the lack of resilience. And I had this question to myself where I was thinking, are these factors by themselves, is this an exhaustive list of factors, or are there more things that we can consider? For example, reconciliation between the parties wherever there needs to be peace building. Should we not focus on, again, rebuilding friendly relations between the parties so that peace can be sustained for a longer period of time? And should we not focus on post-war peace building measures such as maybe raising more awareness, increasing the level of education? Just a thought.
Yes, I would say that the factors I identified were not exhaustive, and it is possible to conceive of other factors, both determinants, if you will, of conflict onset as well as determinants of peace, that would be relevant. I mean, where would transitional justice reconciliation come into play? Maybe it deserves a category on its own of transitional adjustments or arrangements, and we would have to draw on what the literature, what the scholarship tells us about whether and what kind of such arrangements have been successful, have been essential even to consolidating the peace. So yes, I think that is worthy of consideration as well, alongside the other ones that I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to reflect, Richard, on a question I usually ask my students during the exams, but let's see your opinion.
Oh, I'm getting an exam question.
Usually the question is,
prepared.
When does peace building starts and when does peace building end? And kind of the answer I have it never it never ends, and also it never starts. Peace building is something we do every day. Peace is not a given. It's not the natural thing, well, partially, but it's something that needs constant effort. So if we can very much define when peacekeeping starts and when peacekeeping ends, for the peace building, we might not really have those boundaries. When does it start and when does it end? Again,
no, I quite agree. And
students of mine usually know this answer. Now, I wonder, what do you think about it?
I agree. And I think if you were to speak with individuals within the UN today, you would find that most of them take the view that there are not hard and fast distinctions, at least in terms of moments of engagement. We used to sort of have this view reflected in Boutros-Ghali's Agenda for Peace, that peace building was post-conflict. Indeed, that was the term that was used in an Agenda for Peace. But we, ever since now, adoption of this term sustaining peace, we think of peace building efforts as existing from really beginning to end. And as you say, continuously and to some degree, in some cases more than in other cases. But I think that's what's so interesting about the events in the United States of early January around the rally in Washington leading to the assault on the Capitol building. In many ways, and even just throughout the Trump administration, we see that the post-Civil War reconstruction has not finished. There are still so many issues that have not been addressed or have not been addressed adequately in that country. And there's so much in terms of race relations that still remains to be done. And it often isn't until there is an explosion of violence of the sorts that we've seen that it becomes apparent to us. The George Floyd incident, the killing of the black man by white police officers. These things go on sort of, again, below the radar within the country. And then an event of this kind brings it to our attention. But I think as you were saying, Faisal, I mean, not just peace, but also democracy is something that has to be maintained, sustained continuously. It's not something that is established and then can, if you will, survive on its own. It needs to be nurtured continuously. And in some cases, it's more fragile than in other cases. But I think in all cases, it requires support.
I'm just reading a book called The Narrow Corridor by Acemoglu and Robinson, those two who wrote Why Nations Fell a few years back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the new book is called The Narrow Corridor, and it's about liberty. What they say is that liberty is also not something given. It can very easily disappear if government become more despotic or weak. Either way, so exactly, the narrow corridor is narrow because there are two dangers. On one side, we can have a fragile and dysfunctional government that cannot protect the rule of law. On another hand, we can have a strong and despotic government. And the liberty somehow need to squeeze between those two dangers. And that's where the role of the civil society comes. But it's always narrow, as they argue, exactly because of the dangers either way. It's not a given. It's not something that the nature will give us. We need to fight every day for that.
Yeah.
Good. Any other question? We are almost out of time, but
I realize. Yeah, I think I see one hand up, however.
yeah.
Or
All
it's
right.
come down. It's come down.
Yes, it's me. Good evening, professors. Professor, the question is regarding the UN peacekeeping forces. What is their role, and to what extent they can maintain and help in building peace? And do you think it has, had a negative impact in a country rather than having a positive one? Per se, Indian, peacekeeping forces in Sri Lankan civil war. With respect to that,
can it have a negative? Yes, I think that one of the risks is that it can inhibit the movement towards a settlement, And I think that is, for instance, one of the things that we've seen in Cyprus. The country, the peace within the country has been dependent on the continuing presence of the UN. The same thing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Again, I don't think it's a country that's at risk, serious risk of falling back into armed conflict. But I think that the international presence, of which the peacekeepers there are one element, the international presence, I think, has inhibited movement towards a political settlement that would be responsible for, be the foundation for a lasting peace. So to that extent, I think that it is a risk. But, again, the alternative, if the withdrawal would mean the resumption of fighting, that certainly wouldn't be a solution. But in the absence of a settlement, the local politicians don't feel that they have to do the hard work that's required in terms of making compromises to arrive at a political settlement that would be lasting.
Excellent. We are getting to the end of this excellent discussion with Richard Caplan. Thank you very much, Richard, for
It's been my pleasure.
Precious time, really. And as I mentioned, we might bring you back because you are writing a next book on the after exit. So that will be probably one day soon. And I hope this will be physical. We can fly you to Jindal and be together not only for the lecture, but for the dinner and Vice Chancellor treatment after that.
I would welcome that.
I hope the vaccination goes well in the next month.
All of you too. Yes, I hope you all
the
stay
travel
well.
will resume at some point in 2021. We all hope so, and we can do also not only virtual but also physical lectures. Thank you once again. Thank you for all you are doing for Jindal over the last 10 years. We continue our journey, as the Vice Chancellor says usually, to success, and hope to see you again in Sonipat one day. Thank you all the students who asked questions, and
thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Grateful. Thank you so much.